much, and thank you for the introduction. So, as Sylvia said, my name is Liam Walsh, and in this brief 5 minutes, I'm going to try and convince you that fermentation is one of the greatest food processing techniques on earth. So, firstly, fermentation is the chemical breakdown of substance by microorganisms, and there's 4 distinct types of fermentation, all of which follow the same breakdown principles, where sugars in the food are being broken down by microorganisms to produce different fermented products. And one more interesting fact about fermentation before I move on, it's one of the oldest food processing techniques dating back to 7000 BC. So what blew me away when I first started learning about fermenting was the sheer volume of foods that can be fermented. So there's up to 5,000 different varieties of fermented foods, and they account for 1/3 of global food consumption. In addition to this, they're popular worldwide, with each distinct country having some form of fermentation as part of its food culture, including Ireland, whose native fermented food is buttermilk plant, a fermented dairy beverage. So as scientists, we study fermented foods, typically by acquiring a sample first. So let's say cheese from a cheese processing facility. We then extract its DNA in a process called DNA extraction. And then we apply computational and sequencing methods to identify the microorganisms that are found in that particular fermented food. So an example of such an analysis would look like this, where you have a particular fermented food, in this case sauerkraut, and a list of the microbial species that it contains. So if you look here, there's a considerable portion of species in sauerkraut with up to 40 different species. Now, I'm not saying that they have a health benefit, but in terms of microbial diversity, sauerkraut is a fairly good source. So some of the benefits of fermented foods. So the fermentation environment is generally unsuited for bad bacteria. So with a large amount of fermentations, you're typically acidifying the food, creating conditions that are unsuitable for bad bacteria. In addition to this, byproducts of fermentation, such as antimicrobial metabolites, will further restrict the microbial activity of bad bacteria, or the biological activity of bad bacteria. It adds flavors and a novel taste profile. So a typical example of this would be milk and cheese. So if you compare the taste of those, and cheese is a fermented milk product, they taste nothing alike. So this is an example where you can add an awful lot of value to a product through fermentation. It adds health-promoting nutrients to the food, such as vitamins, minerals, and polyphenols. It's a prebiotic, so a large amount of fermented foods will contain a large amount of fiber, which will fuel the microorganisms in your gut, and it's probiotic potentially. So there are some studies that have identified species in fermented foods with probiotic potential, but further research is required into the specific mechanisms by which these microorganisms and their byproducts contribute to health, as well as the amount you need to consume them for a health benefit to occur. So hopefully I've convinced some of you to at least look into fermenting. And if I have, I would strongly recommend beginning with kefir. So there's 2 types of kefir. There's a light yogurt and there's a carbonated beverage. And all you simply need to do to start fermenting is to acquire a starter culture. So this is a collection of microorganisms that will kickstart your fermentation. And I'll talk more about how you source these in the next slide. But simply, you place the starter culture into either milk or sugary water, and you wait for 24 to 72 hours. After that time has elapsed, your fermentation is done, and you will subsequently sieve your fermented product to again acquire the starter cultures, which you can continue to reuse, and you will have these for life, and they will continue to divide and multiply. Once you become more comfortable or more confident with fermentation, you can move on to more complicated ferments, such as sauerkraut or pickled cabbage. So lastly, if you are interested in sourcing starter cultures, you have 2 main avenues in which you can go down. You can buy them online through commercially available websites such as eBay, and they typically seem to be quite cheap. So you'll get them for around a tenner, most expensive probably 20. Or you can ask members of fermented food communities to kindly donate their grains through social media platforms like Facebook. This is something I did as part of my own research, where I put up a Facebook post on one of these pages, and a group in Taiwan kindly responded and donated their grains. I really want to stress that the fermented food community is a great source of information if you are interested in beginning fermentation, and that they're always willing to answer questions, and they're very generous with their grains. So I'd like to thank some of the sources of information from which I built these slides from. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much.